So welcome everyone to this afternoon session. It's a real pleasure. Very excited to have very good two papers and discussions on firm productivity and firm dynamics. So the first paper is going to be presented by Professor Raffaella Sadun from Harvard Business School. And the discussant will be Juanita Gonzalez from LSE. So Raffaella, 20 minutes, the floor is yours.
25.
25, sorry. Okay. 25, sorry. 25.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm going to present a paper that is joint with Amanda Dahlstrand, Dávid László, Helena Schweiger, Oriana Bandiera, and Andrea Prat. And you will see this paper is a little bit different from what we had this morning. This is a paper that speaks to managerial capital and the importance of managerial capital for firm productivity. So let me just first set up the motivation. Firms are obviously key for economic development, and CEOs are key for firm productivity. Now, we have evidence from high-income countries that suggests that there may be a causal, even a causal relationship between the identity of CEOs and the performance of the organizations that they lead. In earlier paper that Oriana, Andrea, and Stephen Hansen wrote a couple of years, more than a couple of years ago, but whatever, a couple of years ago in dog years, I guess, we also showed that it's not just the identity of CEOs that matters, but it's the match between the type of CEOs and the needs of the organization. This paper that we wrote was only about 6 countries, 4 countries that were developed and 2 developing countries. And since that moment, we sort of started mulling around some open questions that we wanted to investigate. The first one is whether the behavior of CEOs, for which we have evidence that comes mostly from high-income countries, could we establish similar relationships, similar evidence also for middle and low-income countries? And the second one is whether this issue of matching of the managerial talent and the needs of the organization followed similar patterns as the one that we had documented in earlier work. This is not as straightforward as a research question to address for a couple of reasons. One is conceptual. It's unclear whether the same patterns of matching of firms and managers would be the same across different environments, specifically because the needs of firms may be completely different. And second, there is an empirical challenge. In the work that we had done earlier, we went to measure the diaries of more than 1,000 CEOs with extreme detail to the activity level. Every window that lasted more than 15 minutes was recorded for a week. And it's unclear whether you could follow that type of really detailed measurement at scale. So in this paper, we address these 2 issues in 2 ways. The first type of contribution is mostly empirical. We develop a parsimonious measure of CEO time use that can actually be scaled across many more organizations than the ones that we had originally studied. And we deployed this measurement in a survey of 5,000 manufacturing firms in 42 countries, most of which are middle-income countries. Just to give you a preview of the findings, we find, first of all, that there is indeed differences in the supply of what we call leadership type of CEOs. Those are people that high level, you should think of them as being coordinator of resources rather than strict operators, people who go down to check the operations of the firm. And we find that there are imbalances in the supply of this particular type of CEOs in poorer countries. We also find, and this is there is one thing to remember about this paper, is this finding, that this is really something, we also find evidence of greater mismatch of managers and firms in poorer countries. So this taken together would suggest that one way to think about increasing productivity is, yes, to increase the supply of human capital and of one specific type of human capital, managerial capital, but also thinking about improving the match between firms and managers. And in fact, we do some counterfactual measurement, and we show that these mismatches can cause, perhaps is a big word, but let's say they are associated with about 18% loss in productivity for mismatched firms and 8% overall. So if you take these estimates if you put some value to these estimates, this suggests that the improvements in productivity from addressing frictions in the matching of managers to organizations could be a valuable way to increase productivity. So I'm going to go very quickly through the related literature, but there are several papers that have studied extensively the importance of CEOs for organizations. This is a literature that by and large started with a historical paper by now by Bertrand and Schoar that exploits the movements of CEOs across organizations to define managerial styles. And this is a paper that is built on the assumption that there is vertical differentiation in managerial quality and that managers can port their talent in the organizations that they lead. In our paper, the one that I just mentioned a few slides ago, we took a different approach. Instead of using CEO fixed effects, which is the variance, if you like, the residual in the performance that can be attributed to CEOs' decision-making and behaviors, we decided to do the crazy stuff. We decided to go and measure behavior directly. So this was the time use surveys that we've run, effectively scaling some techniques, shadowing techniques that had already been developed in the managerial literature. We decided to systematize them and use them across, instead of the original 5 organizations on which Mintzberg had, Mintzberg is a management guru for those of you who have not had the pleasure of meeting Harry Mintzberg. This was a technique that was built on 5 people. We scaled it to more than 1,000. And from this work, that's where we derived the idea that there are different behavioral types across CEOs. I'll explain this more in a moment. In particular, the types of behavioral differences that we uncover using the detailed diary data combined with some machine learning techniques is that by and large, CEOs are divided in 2 types. We call them leaders and managers. The labels are entirely arbitrary. We attribute these labels based on, again, some managerial literature that makes the distinction between CEOs or managers more generally that are primarily dedicating their time to creating organizational alignment. So think about the coordination function of bringing different experts together or building consensus, putting significant investments in interpersonal communication versus CEOs, in our case, that are much more involved with the operations of their firms and that directly, for example, give orders on the shop floor in the case of manufacturing firms and are mostly about monitoring the operations of the organization. This is a little bit similar to the notion of delegation. Managers who coordinate the work of others versus managers that do the work of others directly. So in this earlier work, we showed that there are differences in leader behavior. We showed that these differences matter for firm productivity. But in this paper, we tried to go one step further and extend massively the cross-section of countries in which we can look at this question. And in particular, we are very interested in the notion of mismatching, which is something that is different from the idea that there is only one type, one type of manager, and there is a vertical differentiation across managers. We are interested really in the matching of firms with firms. Sorry, of managers with firms. So the contributions are effectively 3. Thinking about extending the measurement of CEO behaviors, showing some more evidence on the matching, how the matching of CEOs to firms varies across firms, and then contributing hopefully to the literature on misallocation. In this case, it's not misallocation of tangible inputs, but it's a misallocation of managerial inputs. So what's the setting for our study? We study 42 countries that are covered by the EBRD survey. These are countries that have a wide variation in terms of GDP per capita. It's about 10% of the world's population. And for our interests, this is a good setting because there is a good range of countries across different development stages. The survey data is the EBRD World Bank Enterprise Surveys. So this is a very high quality instrument that is where the data is collected through face-to-face interviews. It's a stratified random sampling of firms with more than 50 employees. And then we combine this information with our diary data that was collected earlier in 2016, I think. So this is the way in which we measure the CO time use in the survey data. As I said, it's face-to-face surveys with managers. The key piece of this data, how are we able to capture CO behavior in such a large sample? Well, effectively what we do is the following. We exploit the richness of the diary data, and we extract what are the variables that are most likely to predict leader behavior. And it turns out that at the end of the day, if you want to be very synthetic in your data collection, there are effectively 4 types of behaviors that are most correlated with this leadership index. And they are asking the amount in a typical week, how often does the top manager meet with the top echelon of the organization, how many meetings involve the top managers include also other participants. This is to see whether there are meetings that are more than just beyond the one-on-one types of interactions. On the negative is whether the manager meets, how often the manager meets with supplier and how often the CEO meets with production. The last 2 are obvious. These are activities that are more likely to capture this operational focus compared to the first 2. This is the benefit of going through these 4 measures is that, of course, you lose a lot of detail, but that's what makes it feasible to collect in large samples. So what we could do was include these variables in the EBRD surveys and get for a much larger cross-section of companies information on the behaviors of the CEOs. We use this data to create an overall CO time use index. To simplify things, we create a binary leader variable that is effectively based on the median value of the combined 4 indices together. And it turns out that it's also quite close to the mean. So we've done a lot of robustness on how we simplify the construction of the variable. And this is not it doesn't really change much, the results. So I want to show you in the rich 12 minutes that I have 3 things. First of all, I want to give you a description of these leaders and the firms that they run. Some ideas of the matching patterns between high income countries and middle income countries, and then evidence on whether there is, if there is mismatch between CEOs and firms and the quantification of this mismatch. The ways in which we think about the mismatch is as follows. We know from we have both in the diary data and in the EBRD sample, we have a few high-income countries. Effectively, we treat this sample of highest income countries as our training sample. And so we derive a prediction based on firm characteristics. What are the firm characteristics that are most likely, that are most associated with the presence of a leader CEO? And this is our training sample. And then we go into the other part of the sample, our testing sample, the lower income countries. And the prediction that we derive from the training sample gives us an indication of whether that type of firm, based on its characteristics, should be matched with a leader CEO. So it's actually fairly simple in terms of implementation. In the data, we find that the distribution of leader, this is just the raw data, the leader index in the training and in the testing data sets. This is an index that is normally distributed, quite simple between the testing sample and the training sample, although you can see that in the training sample, which is made of the higher income countries, this index is shifted to the right. They are more likely to find these leader CEOs in the training sample. The first result is just a replication of what we find in the earlier JP paper, which is that there is a strong correlation between the productivity of firms and the presence of a CEO that is more likely to be, that is in our definition, a leader. This is the time use index. This is just to show you that the results hold in this new sample with magnitudes that are incredibly close to what we had found in the earlier work, and even controlling for other source of management capital, for example, the quality of the management practices adopted in the firm. The share of leaders increases with the country income. This is just another way to look at that distribution to the right that I was describing a moment ago. And the correlation between performance or size of the firm is quite similar between the testing sample and the training sample. Now, to get at this question of whether there is indeed mismatching of CEOs and firms, we ask the following question. We ask whether firms that are predicted to have a leader end up having a leader, and what's their productivity. And we compare the productivity of these correct matches to the productivity of the companies that, at least in our methodology, appear to be mismatched. We get at the question of horizontal differentiation by looking at both the mismatches of companies that need a leader and are assigned to a manager, and companies that need a manager and are assigned to a leader. So this is telling us that it's not just, we effectively are testing whether is it just one type of CEO that is associated with greater productivity, or is there more of a horizontal match that matters for productivity. Let me just skip, in the interest of time, the details of how we get at the prediction, but at a high level, we run a lasso that selects what are the company characteristics that are most likely to be associated with a leader CEO in the training sample. And then we use these variables to form a prediction of the type of CEO that the company should have based on the high-income countries' predictions. The key result that I want to focus on is the following. When we look at the correlation between productivity and this predicted leader propensity, we can distinguish between firms that need a leader and firms that need a manager. And then we summarize the mismatch in 3 ways. First of all, it's companies that need a leader but get a manager. So these are companies that typically are larger and need a CEO, according to our data, that is more focused on coordination tasks, but instead they get somebody who is very operational. We can also look at firms that need a manager but get a leader. These are firms that need more of this operational attention and instead get somebody who is more focused on the coordination tasks. And then finally, it's mismatch on a mismatch dummy that combines both these sources of mismatches. So here is what we see in the regression. This is a specification of the regression that I just described. Effectively, if a deviation from the predicted CEO type captures something that is suboptimal, then we would expect this to be reflected in firm-level outcomes. This is the regression. The dependent variable is log labor productivity. You can see the main piece, the main result is that the mismatch is associated with a lower log labor productivity. These two variables are telling, opening up the mismatch in these two sources are both associated with lower productivity. I want to just stay on this result for a moment. This is what we use to infer that, in fact, there isn't just one type of CO that matters for firm performance, but what matters is the matching between the CO and the type of firm. In the rest of the, okay, so I want to show you just one more result that we leverage the results of this table to do some counterfactuals. And in particular, we are interested in understanding whether, what would be, sorry, let me just skip to, this is just the, okay. We want to do some back of the envelope calculation to quantify what is the loss in productivity that is due to this mismatch. So to do that, we calculate this, we use a very simple formula for counterfactual sales. The counterfactual is the sales of firms that are correctly matched. You can see that this is exactly the amount of sales that they have. These are companies that shouldn't be corrected, their matching should not be corrected. And then we calculate the counterfactual sales of the companies that were mismatched by using the losses, sort of compensating for the losses of productivity that we estimated in the previous table. The betas are estimated from the regression that the regression table that I just discussed. And what we find is that the sources, first of all, about 9% of the losses in sales could be recouped if we had no mismatches in the allocation of COs to firm. So that's first number is 9%, which is a pretty large number. The second thing that we do in the paper is to think about two ways in which these losses in productivity could be recouped. The first one is by increasing the supply of leaders. So that would be, for example, increasing the number of the people that are trained in business school. You should think about, if you believe that business schools create leaders, which I don't know if everybody believes that, but whatever. But that would be like, let's increase the supply of leaders, and then the other source would be, let's improve the allocation of people to companies. The supply can stay fixed, but we just improve the ways in which managers are allocated to firms. In our data, we find that about half of the misallocation, half of the loss in productivity is due to misallocation. And we have different ways of calculating this source of misallocation. For example, in the counterfactual, in one case, we take the supply of leaders as given, and we randomly allocate them to companies that are assigned to managers. In another case that would be more targeted, we rank the companies according to how badly they would need a leader. That's part of the prediction exercise. And so obviously, when you improve the match with this more targeted method, correcting for the misallocation has a stronger impact on productivity. The rest of the paper, which I will not discuss today, and it's something that perhaps will come up in the discussion, is our attempt of answering what I think is really the crucial question here. The first one is, at the firm level, why is it that certain firms get this match right? And so we have some evidence in the analysis that shows that companies that are more exposed to competition, companies that have better governance, at least based on the measures of board governance that we have in the BRD sample, are less likely to be mismatched. So we think that one margin here is to work on both the exposure to competition as well as basic governance measures. The second question is, what can we do to improve the supply of leaders? And so part of our exploration now is exploiting the presence of business schools across different countries, and in particular the timing of the arrival of business schools across different countries, to hypothesizing that that's one direct way in which you build managerial expertise. And so part of the analysis that we're working on exploits this variation both across and within countries in the availability of business schools, measuring, exploiting, in the case where we look at within countries variation, exploiting the distance of the business school from the firm. But I will not discuss this now. So let me just conclude. We have a lot of robustness. I would say that the first thing to take away from this paper is on the measurement side. It is possible to measure aspects of managerial capital, which is typically intangible, through a very parsimonious set of questions. And we think that this is actually quite promising from a measurement perspective. The second is that this distinction in managerial behavior matters for firm productivity. Obviously, we cannot establish the causality. These are mostly cross-country regressions, but in earlier work, we could at least use the assignment of the arrival of the CEO in the company and exploit the time series variation. And we believe that this is also important because it tells us that there is one channel that is related to the matching of firms to managers that could be relevant for firm productivity. And then finally, it's also the importance of thinking about not just vertical differentiation in managers, but also horizontal differentiation, which is something that is often missed in the discussions of CEOs and the importance of top management for organizations. So I'm going to stop here with some indications that these channels could potentially be quite relevant, at least if you believe our estimates. I'll stop here. Thank you. Okay. That was quick.
So thank you very much, Raffaella. And now we have Juanita from London School of Economics discussing the paper. You have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the organizers for inviting me to discuss this paper. I was telling Raffaella before that I read many of her papers, so it's a great opportunity to be able to discuss them. So thank you so much. Okay, so let me start with what I think is my take on this paper, and then I'll be more specific on my comments. There's basically 3 of them. Okay, so here's my view of this paper. So I think this paper is about providing novel evidence that there's at least 2 types of CEOs. Some of them are leaders, some of them are managers, and then understanding how mismatches between the types of leaders, the types of CEOs that managers should have and the ones that they actually have can help explain these differences in productivity across countries. Now, the way that they go around showing this is very interesting. So the first thing they do is they go back to their previous work by using like the CEO diaries, and then I think they do like a service to the profession, which is they simplify that very difficult way of really approaching how to measure CEO types by creating this questionnaire, which could be used by anyone that's really trying to do research in this area, and I myself am using that, so that is really something that I think it's a really great contribution from this paper, beyond showing some external validity from what they've done before. Now, having done that, this classification, then their main finding is that middle-income countries, basically you have fewer CEOs that are leaders and more mismatches, between the CEOs that firms should have and the ones that they actually have, and then they go around quantifying what's the cost of these mismatches and these issues in the economy, and they estimated around, I thought it was like 20% of productivity loss, the 18% that you were mentioning before. And at the final part of the paper, and Raffaella didn't have much time to talk about this, but I'll discuss it a little bit, they link this kind of like issues in the CEO market to missing high quality formal business education opportunities for individuals. Okay, so why do I think this paper matters, or where do I see it fitting within the literature? So the first thing is it's a new focus. If you look at most of the papers that have been written about CEOs, and specifically about their market and how much we understand, for example, how they're paid, they're typically written for a small subsample of firms, which are important, publicly listed firms, for example. But it's refreshing to see a paper that is extending that analysis to a wider cross-section of firms, and that also vary quite a bit in terms of size. They have a very interesting finding, as Raffaella kept saying. It's really important to understand that CEOs are not just unilaterally better or worse. You could think about different types at least, so managers and leaders. And when we consider the frictions along the market between firms trying to find the right type of leader, that can help us understand why is it that we see this difference in productivity across high income and middle income countries. So really interesting results. And finally, just the economic effects are striking. They're very large. So I think those are all very important reasons why we should care. And when you think about specifically the literature on misallocation, I think what this paper is doing, which is great, is shedding light on one particular type of misallocation. And I would call this kind of like, the CEO type misallocation that helps you understand these productivity differences. So overall, a great paper. You can see I'm a fan. Sensible story, really interesting results, easy to read, love it. 3 comments, first on interpretation, second on quantification, and then finally on the causes of missing leaders. So let me move on to my comments. So my first comment is on interpretation. I think this is conceptually the comment that I think is most important from the 3. And what I was thinking throughout as I was reading the paper is there is this notion in the paper where there's this idea that CEOs are of a particular type, and firms need a particular type of CEO, for example, at different points in their development. But what I kept thinking the whole time is that it seems a bit like the perception is that the type is something that is idiosyncratic from the perspective of the CEOs. But I thought, well, kind of like how CEOs behave is going to depend quite a lot on how else does the team that the CEO have looks like. In particular, I was thinking, CEOs, you could imagine they're going to have more time to be leaders if they have other middle managers to do the managing for them. And I think the reason why this becomes important in this particular exercise, when you're comparing high-income countries to middle-income countries, is that I think that in middle-income countries, and we have growing evidence of this, there is a lot of issues in terms of finding good middle managers. And so for me, I think one important conceptual question was, how much of what the authors are identifying as CEO style and CEO mismatches should be attributed not only to dysfunctions in the CEO market, but also in the market of middle managers. And so my suggestions here are really first, potentially just a broader interpretation. When you discuss the results, think about the manager as well as managing a team, and if the team is less or better, the CEO will have more or less time to be a leader versus a manager. I'm an empiricist, so obviously as much as we can account for that in some way, I would love to see. I think it's going to be hard. I can imagine that, in the surveys, there's not going to be a great indicator of exactly what's the organizational structure of the firm. This is typically difficult to measure, but a few ideas come to mind. So I've done some work on this using Revelio data, probably not great for specifically manufacturing firms, but we could get indicators as of, for certain countries, this is on average how organizational structure looks, how many layers do organizations have, and kind of correlate that with the exercises that they're doing. Likewise, perhaps some of the estimates in the paper by Hort, Malmberg, and Schulman, there could be another source to play around a little bit with the data. So that's kind of like my first comment, is about interpretation. Second comment is about quantification. I really like the exercise. So the comment here is not, something about the methodology. My comment is coming more from curiosity. So if I understood correctly what was going on here, if you look at the prediction of which are the types of firms that are more likely to be needing leaders, some of the factors that were important in that estimation was first size, so the bigger firms are more likely to be needing leaders, and also some specific sectors. So I think the sectors were food and products, food products and rubber, where is it? No, rubber and plastics, office accounting and computing. And so I saw that regression, and then the paper also shows us that based on that regression, there seems to be not that many leaders in middle-income countries. And then what I wanted to know was, well, what were the factors that were driving that lack of leaders? Is it a size story? So is it what's going on that we have some largest firms, in these middle-income countries, and we don't have enough leaders for them? Or is it instead that this problem is concentrated in a particular sector? And if it's a sector problem, so imagine, the rubber and plastics kind of issue going on there, if it's a sector problem, then how much does it matter then when I think about high-income economies and middle-income economies, the representative firms in those sectors may be, for example, at different points or links within the value chain. Does it matter? Does it not? So I think it's more about scratching the data and kind of telling us exactly where that lack of CEOs is coming from, and providing some guidance for the reader to understand how much do differences across countries, for example, in terms of the average firm and sectors, matter for that comparison. Likewise, when it comes to the actual quantification of how much we could potentially fix by basically randomly allocating CEOs to where they should be. So again, it's exactly the same comment. Depending on where the CEOs are missing, then the solution will entail, for example, taking CEOs that are leaders in very small firms and placing them in very large companies. Is it realistic to think that if you're a leader in a small company, would you be able to be a leader in a large firm? Or is it instead bringing CEOs from one sector to the next? Hopefully you get my point. This is more about explaining exactly how you go about really fixing this potential misallocation through this, reallocation of leaders. So it's more curiosity. Just tell us more. I think the reader, at least, I wanted to know a little bit more. Finally, my last comment has to do with what Raffaella was mentioning at the end, that she didn't get much time to show. And so one interesting finding that they show in the paper is that part of this mismatches or dysfunctions in the CEO market are correlated with the availability of business education opportunities, high quality business education opportunities in certain regions. And so this builds towards my last comment, which is discussing causes. And I really like the idea of thinking about the importance of business schools. I, after all, work in a business school, so I would like to think that we're important. But I also think that labor is the main endowment of most individuals. And if you think about middle-income countries, I think what that means is that a very important source for learning how to be a manager is learning from where you work. So I would like to see a little bit more in terms of opportunities for learning to be a leader outside of the classroom. And we have good evidence from research that if you work at a larger firm, at a more productive firm, or at firms that have, for example, better management practices, going back to Raffaella's own work, you could potentially imagine that people will learn exactly the traits that you need to be a leader. And so the data that I'm showing you here comes from my own work, where I've been looking a little bit at this question using LinkedIn data. And in the plot to the left, and this is just as a motivation, what I have here is I've divided firms by age buckets. So the ones in blue are going to be the very young ones, and the ones in less than 10 years old, and the ones in green are going to be the older firms. And what I'm doing here is for every year that I can see new appointments of managers, I'm basically asking which fraction of these individuals have an MBA or formal business background. And then as you can see, what we see over time is a decrease in the importance of this formal business education. Of course, this is just motivational. This is not to say that MBAs don't matter. But in the plot to the right, what you can see is, again, from my own work, if you focus on the very young firms and you focus on one particular source of potential learning outside of the classroom, which is having the startup that you work on participate, for example, in a business accelerator program or in a government support program that is tried in this business, what you observe is that newly appointed managers are now coming from these types of firms, the ones that have been exposed to these programs, at a rate that is comparable to the individuals that have some sort of formal business training. So anyway, my last comment was that, thinking about sources of learning outside of the classroom, but it's a great paper. I encourage everyone to read it. Thank you very much.
So now we have 10 minutes for discussion. I think if you want to take like a couple of minutes to maybe answer.
I just want to thank you because that was great. Thank you. Very positive first, and second also very constructive. Really appreciate it. Yeah.
Welcome. So now we open to the floor. We have a couple of here in the front. Then I come.
Very interesting paper. So I just wanted to say there's complementary evidence. So, which I think you might find interesting. And that is, I have a paper with Cam Harvey and John Graham in the JFE, which looks at, which asks the question, what are the behavioral traits of CEOs? Does it differ from others in the teams like CFOs? And does it differ between the US and non-US? So we actually measure risk aversion by giving gambles in the Barty et al. Kind of thing. Yeah. We measure optimism the way the psychologist does by giving a LOTAR test. And what we find is the short results, CEOs are much more optimistic and risk-loving than CFOs, which may not surprise you. And if you compare US versus non-US CEOs, US CEOs, again, they are much more risk-loving, they are much more optimistic. And so Franklin Allen has, this paper where he says, why do you find all these differences across countries and, the objective function that seems to be pursued by firms? And one reason could be that their traits are just different. So anyway, completely different measures, but I think it's complementary.
I love your
it
paper.
Supports
totally.
what you have.
I have seen and cited your paper. Yes, very consistent.
Yeah, so perhaps related. So if I think of a CEO or a leader, I think about the ability to innovate, perhaps the risk-loving attitude. So I didn't see these characteristics among those that you used to distinguish. So how should I think about that? And then another point is probably these characteristics like ability to innovate, risk-loving attitude are more important in some sectors than in other high-tech sectors. Do you have any evidence, or can you look into cross-sector differences, because the impact on productivity might be very different?
Very nice paper. How do you transition from being a firm that needs a manager to being a firm that needs a leader? Right? If firms that need a leader tends to be the bigger, publicly traded, and so on, maybe I need a leader before I become such a big firm. So in that case, mismatch may not be a bad thing.
Julian, you want to
I'm just curious what fraction of the managers are founders were their family members, and how does the productivity loss here compare with the productivity loss of having too many family firms in many developing countries?
Yes. Should I answer?
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
Okay, so I'll start from the last one. Actually, this is a very important variable for us, and I think it speaks to the selection of the leader. So one of the things that we're exploring is that as a source of friction. So absolutely well taken. On your question, this is all cross-sectional data, and so I cannot measure the evolution of the match of the company from one stage to another. But intuitively, I think it has to do with the complexity of the operations of the firm, and so that's why firm size is so important. And going back to your point of innovation, we don't measure it directly, but it's everything that has to do with going from something that you can monitor or to, for example, product innovation or process innovation. I think that these are typically activities, and I'm speaking more from the perspective of qualitative evidence than quantitative evidence, but these are activities where the role of the leader is not so much to do himself or herself, but is to enable the work of others. So I think that it's at that stage that this ability to corral expertise and motivate people who have different capabilities becomes very important. And then I already told that I really love your paper. Okay.
So can we come here, Helena?
Thanks a lot. I recall a paper of Daron and the co-authors that pointed to the fact that when firms, I think it was on Danish data, when firms had the MBA CEOs, unfortunately, one of the outcomes was actually cutting the workforce, and this is what made them more profitable.
The wage bill.
Apparently,
yeah.
Yes, which was maybe not the first attribute you would want to have for an MBA, but apparently there was a kind of bias for students who had been educated in business school, myself being in a business school. So, but it was Danish data. So, but
yeah, the Danish MBAs are terrible.
Look, but so just to caution maybe about your policy recommendation of
to increase MBAs. No, to be honest, look, I mean, it's a great paper. I'm not sure that I fully agree with all the results or that the results make me feel good. But I think the more general point, and this relates to your comment, is that I think that managerial capabilities are not something that appear just because you're the firstborn son. I think that the more general point is that you need to nurture them or you need to recognize them, and the MBA piece is a very rough proxy of at least selection into learning some of these skills, which I think become very important. I mean, I'm not really worrying so much about the US situation. I'm more worried about situations where you have firms that are often quite large, and there are lots of resources, workers and capital that are concentrated in these firms, and it's unclear whether they do have the capabilities or the willingness to acquire these capabilities.